Panic. He knew that's what he should be feeling. Instead, he was too tired to feel much of anything. He'd been in the ER long enough to lose track of time and any semblance of order. He was hungry, but didn't feel like eating. He was thirsty, but didn't want to ask for water. Why? Because Marie was dead. While he sat on the portable hospital bed and they drained vial after vial of blood from his arm, the steady but slow rhythm of the electrocardiograph beeps provided a constant backdrop of sound. He heard it below the speech of the doctors and the clinking of medical equipment. The CDC docs looked like astronauts in their gear. The only differentiating features among them were the name tags taped to their suits and their height. Disaster movies kept playing through his head. There was always high drama, people with strained voices, and some kind of invisible clock ticking down. This was nothing like that. Instead, it was boring. The CDC doctors spoke in technical jargon and in slightly disinterested voices. They were professionals, sure, but Darren expected at least some excitement among them. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was because they already knew their patient was dying and there was nothing they could do to stop it. When the beeping sound's gentle rhythm skipped into dubstep, he peeked through the paper curtains. 2 doctors were already dragging a crash cart to Marie's bed. Although a sheet covered her legs and torso, it was easy to see something bad was going on beneath it. The sheet's normal white was crusted in places with dark red and yellow stains. Darren would have retched if he had anything in his stomach. The dubstep beat disappeared into a flat line of sound. The doctors looked at one another. 3 other doctors stepped into view. They pulled away the sheet. Darren wanted to scream. The flesh on her legs looked like spoiled cream cheese. Large swaths peeled off as they lifted the sheet. Blood wept from the wounds, but it was too dark, too black. Her face was little more than a pale bruise. Her breasts, not large to begin with, had shrunk into themselves. Darren wanted to look away but couldn't. A doctor lifted the paddles and placed them on her chest. 250 joules, a muffled voice said. The defibrillator whined as it charged. Ready, one of the docs said. Clear, the one holding the paddles yelled. The doctor pressed down. The sound of electricity arcing from the machine and into Marie's still form echoed in the room. The machine maintained its steady, flat-line buzz. Charging, another voice said. Ready. Clear. The doctor placed the paddles on the chest and pressed down. A loud ripping sound vibrated Marie's body. What the doctor had time to say before the paddles, along with his hands, sank through the woman's chest. The room filled with the sound of sizzling fat on a hot plate. The doctor screamed in agony and lifted his arms away from the bed. His hands were gone at the wrist. A primal scream started in Darren's mind. The doctor wobbled on his feet and started to fall backward. A tentacle, blacker than deepest space, flew out of the chest cavity and wrapped around the doctor's neck. His scream died as he was pulled into Marie's chest. The sizzling sound was deafening. The doctor's body disappeared into the table's void. Doctors yelled in surprise. Marie's body melted away as a black pool of viscous liquid flowed over the sides of the table and onto the floor. The metal beneath gleamed as if polished. The pool moved across the floor toward the doctors, still frozen in terror. Darren finally found his voice, and the scream locked in his throat pierced the air. He stumbled toward the room's exit. A uniformed security guard pelted toward him through the plastic tunnel. He held up a hand and yelled for Darren to stop. A chorus of shrieks made Darren turn back toward the room. The black pool spread across the floor and covered the doctor's feet. One of the suited figures fell forward into the black pool. The body immediately dissolved. Another doctor fell backwards onto the floor, legs raising into the air. His feet were missing below the ankle. The last in the trio screamed and screamed as tendrils of black fluid rose up his suit. He dissolved feet first into the floor. "What the fuck is that?" the guard screamed. Darren didn't want to know. He sprinted past the man and reached the tunnel's edge. Behind him, he heard more screams and cries of pain. When he found himself in the parking lot, he kept running. He barely noticed the cold sheets of rain drenching his skin or the freshening wind. Visitors. That's what Mike said. Only that's not all he said. The visitors? The goddamned CDC. Jacob stared at the display on his left. The screen was split in four, giving him 2 views of the parking area and a view at each of the emergency exits. The images showed swirling rain and not much else. It was incredibly difficult to make out shapes, let alone details. Jacob sighed. What a shitty night. He'd had to let EMTs into the building, watch them take Marie away, and calm down Maeve. And now, the frickin' CDC? He glanced at the other monitor. The split screen cycled between the lab hallway as well as the second and third floors. With the exception of Maeve and Darren coming down with Marie, there hadn't been much to see. Maeve was back in her mother's office. Mike hadn't left his. And now that Darren was gone, he couldn't even look forward to the man coming down for a chat. Well, at least he had a book to read in between checking the monitors. Probably best to do that after the CDC showed up, though. Wouldn't want to get caught. One of the screens twitched. He cocked an eyebrow, blinked, and then stared at it. It was in the parking lot. The camera image distorted, flickered, and then went dead. It wasn't conscious, but his hand drifted down to the butt of his pistol. Jacob stood from his station and peered into the darkness beyond the heavily tinted glass doors. Something moved in his peripheral vision. He swung his eyes back to the monitor. The other view of the parking lot displayed nothing but black, just like its twin. He unsnapped the holster and tapped a finger against the pistol butt. Jacob quickly scanned the other screens. The scientists were still doing their thing in the lab. Nothing moved on either of the upper floors, so whatever was going on... Then he heard it. A roaring sound followed by the shriek of sirens. Something moved outside the glass doors. He walked to them. They should have auto-locked after the EMTs left with Marie. No one should be able to get in here without a keycard. Behind the bulletproof glass, he was completely safe. So why were his nerves sizzling with trepidation? The sirens were closer. That's the CDC and the cops and... Something banged outside the door. He walked closer to them, pistol halfway out of its holster. The dim glow of the street light lamps had disappeared. Everything was black through the glass. What the hell is going on? He walked closer, the pistol almost fully out of the holster. He put his nose to the glass and held his free hand over his eyes to block the glare from the overheads. The entrance to the building was covered. Blocked. Something yellow or orange flapped in the wind. Jacob gritted his teeth. What the hell is... A gloved hand smacked into the glass. Jacob jumped back, heart pounding in his chest. A figure pressed itself to the entry doors. CDC! A muffled voice said. Let us in, now! Jacob released the pistol and it fell back into the holster. He didn't bother snapping it. Until he knew for sure who this clown was, he wasn't taking any chances. He reached next to the door and hit the red open button. The door locks clicked. The figure remained where it was. Rolling his eyes, Jacob pushed open the door. Beneath the sounds of wind and rain, he heard the growl of engines and the clanking of metal on metal. Distant, excited voices yelled at one another, but he couldn't understand what they were saying. The figure walked inside along with 2 others. Jacob stood aside to give them room, hand back on his holster. He blinked at the invaders. Dressed in green moon suits, they looked like strange aliens dropped into his universe. The trio looked at one another, and then one walked back to him. Through the faceplate, he saw the face of a less-than-homely woman. Her eyes shined with excitement. She held out her federal ID. My name is Dr. Melanie Hoyt. I'm with the CDC. He blinked at her. She tapped her foot. What's your name? Oh, I'm Jacob. You the only guard? One of the more stout figures behind Hoyt asked. Jacob nodded and took the badge from Hoyt. He stared at it. CDC? Yeah. Her picture? Yeah. She looked much better without that moonsuit. He looked up at her, smiled, and handed it back. Have you been exposed to the agent? Jacob blinked again. This was just too goddamn surreal. What agent? The woman rolled her eyes. The contagion. Were you exposed to the barrel, the oil, the labs, or Ms. Krieger? No. The woman continued staring at him. I mean, I opened the doors for the EMTs to get her and take her to the hospital, but I didn't get, breathed on or anything. And you haven't had contact with the oil? He shook his head. No, Dr. Hoyt, I'm just the schlep who guards the door. She nodded and then looked around the foyer. He cleared his throat. And who are they? Dr. Glaze and Dr. Duggar, she said. Is this foyer the biggest public area? He snickered. It's the only public area. Everything else is locked off. She nodded again and looked at her companions. This will do for a quarantine area. We'll make it easy for us to get supplies, too. Quarantine? Jacob rubbed his hands together. Mike said something about that, but I didn't think he was serious. Hoyt turned and looked at him. Mr. Beaudry told you we were coming. He told you there would be a quarantine. And you didn't believe it? Surreal, he mumbled. Where are the labs? She asked. He pointed to the security doors. Back there. The only way into the labs is through those doors. She nodded to herself and clicked something on her belt. Control? Hoyt. Bring the supplies to the front. We'll bring them in. Over. Jacob heard a staticky reply, but it was too low for him to understand. Supplies? She held up a finger to shush him, and then tapped the radio again. Yes, Jacob, supplies. We need to get into the lab. Now. Jacob nodded. Mike had told him to get them whatever they needed. He walked to the security doors and then stopped. He turned and looked at Hoyt. Did you take out my security cameras? A sneer appeared on her face. Yes. He nodded dreamily. Good, because I thought I was having a stroke. He turned back to the door. Through the heavy steel, he heard a crash and someone yelling. Jacob slid his badge across the sensor. He jerked open the door and peered in. The NMR was still running. Neither Jay nor Kate was interested in seeing the results now. They had bigger problems. The first was simple, figuring out what to do. Jay suggested they move to the front of the lab. Kate thought that was a great idea. Backs against the glass wall, just inches away from the hallway, the pair watched the shadows. The hunger she'd felt before the fluoroscopy had dissolved into heartburn, and damn it, she needed to pee. I'm, still waiting to hear an idea, Jay said. Idea. Yeah, right. CDC coming in, quarantine. They were trapped with something, and Jay wanted ideas. Great, like some magical light bulb was going to pop into existence over her. Jay? What? He asked without turning around. She grinned. We have lots of powerful lights in here. Yeah, so? She opened her mouth to say something sarcastic and then stopped. Jay's hands were shaking. He was terrified. She hissed through her teeth instead. What happened when we bathed it in full-spectrum light? Shit, sorry. I guess my genius took the night off. He looked around the lab. The halogens. Yes, the halogens, Kate said. If we turn all the table lights on, we might be able to keep it cornered. Yeah, that could work. You don't sound convinced. Jay turned to her. His face was pale and he looked exhausted. In other words, he looked exactly like she felt. We could point some of the lights toward it, but just where the hell do we try and drive it? She bit her lip. He had a point. Kate scanned the lab, much as Jay had done. Her eyes focused on the waste drain in the far corner of the room. Jay, we are idiots. What? She lifted a finger and pointed to the far corner. The shadows were extremely thick in that area. If M2 was afraid of the light, it would be the perfect place to make it feel safe. The waste drain. We could drive it down into the waste tank. We just have to open the seal and drive it down. And it'll be trapped, Jay said to himself. He clucked his tongue. Great horny toads, Yosemite Sam said. I think we got us a plan. She was scared to death, sure, but that didn't mean she wasn't chuckling. She punched him in the arm. "Try and be serious. That wascally wabbit," she said, pointing to the shadows, "isn't a damned cartoon." "Sorry, you're right. So how do you want to do this?" "First, we need to point all the halogens at the floor. Create some kind of barrier." "Yeah, and I think we need to turn up the overheads." He pointed to the rectangular lights in the ceiling. "The fluorescence may not hurt it, but at least we'll be able to see it." "Good idea," she said. "Keep watch." "Yes, ma'am." Kate tapped his arm. Through the suit's protection, she barely even felt the impact. She walked sideways toward the door. Finally, she turned away from the lab itself and stared at the stainless steel control panel. 2 dimmer switches, along with a keyed power cutoff, stared back at her. She placed her fingers on the first dimmer switch and turned toward the lab interior. She spun the knob. Half the lab's fluorescent lights quickly brightened. The deep shadows by the tables disappeared. The table with the fluoroscope remained clothed in dim light. "Let's see what you think of this," she said, and spun the second knob. The lights in the ceiling blazed down. The stained tile floor reflected the light back at her eyes, and she had to squint. Jay lifted a hand to his faceplate to block the glare. After blinking several times, she was finally able to see, but she wished she had a pair of sunglasses. The shadows were gone. Except for the furthest recesses of the tables and equipment, there was only the gleam of metal and light bouncing off every surface. And there it was, right where they'd last seen it. Stains led up to the side of the fluoroscope, but where M2 had touched the floor, the tile surface was immaculate and shining. With the lights blazing down, the pool of M2 was obvious. The shadows where it had hidden were no longer dark and foreboding, but just a dimness of the light. Against the bright white of the surrounding tile, it looked blacker than anything she'd ever seen. Jay cleared his throat. "Well, there it is." "Yeah." Kate stepped to the nearest table. "You grab the other one." "Point it where?" "Let's make a path," she said. "Make sure it can't come after us." "This is nuts." He walked to one of the tables, pointed the gooseneck lamp to the floor ahead of him, and flicked the switch. A bright rectangle of light appeared on the floor. It was slightly diffused, but more than enough to cast a broad spectrum. She hoped. Kate did the same with the table lamp nearest her. They made their way down the row. Each time they turned on a new light, they made sure to point it at the floor and targeted so it continued the barrier. When they were only a few meters away from the fluoroscope, Kate stopped. The M2 hadn't moved since they started their experiment. Could it see them? Could it hear them? "Jay?" He turned to her, his hand on the next lamp. "Yeah?" "What do we do if it moves past the lights?" His face paled. "I guess we run." She shivered. Maeve was on the floor above them, hopefully asleep, and hopefully unaware any of this shit was going on. They had to make sure the M2 stayed in the lab. The idea of that stuff getting out of here and loose in the building was terrifying. The last 2 tables. They were down to the last 2 tables. Kate switched on a lamp and followed the routine of aiming it. Jay was still a meter away from the last table on his side. Why? Because it was the fluoroscopy table. The suit made it difficult, but Jay squatted, his eyes focused on the pool of deep black. "All we have in this lab are LED flashlights." Kate giggled, but it came out more as a shuddering wheeze. "We have everything aimed." She tapped her foot. "What we need is a long extension cord." Jay groaned into the mic and stood up. "Keep your eyes on that thing." "I will. What are you going to do?" "You'll see," Jay said. She heard his gentle footfalls as he headed back to the front of the lab. Kate swallowed hard and then focused her tired eyes on the pool of M2. It was an amorphous shape. Instead of a circle or oval, the pool had the occasional runner jutting out from its center. It reminded her of something she'd seen in biology class, something bacterial or viral. Her life consisted of carbon rings, methane units, and chemical bonds. Crude oil, atmospheric samples, wastewater from manufacturing plants, sewage runoffs. Nothing biological. This was a whole new ballgame. So what was it? Her mind raced over their experiments: low gravity, hydrocarbon characteristics, anaerobic, broad-spectrum light sensitivity. Hell, she didn't even know its actual flashpoint. It bubbled and boiled when it came in contact with any source of illumination that approximated sunlight. But could it actually burn? And if it did, what would it release? In the fluoroscope's vacuum, there was no oxygen to make flame. Would it have caught fire if it had been in an aerobic environment? She didn't know. And what was it going to do when they hit it with the halogens? Jay's tongue clucking brought her back to the world. In what little peripheral vision the faceplate provided, she could see something in his hands. "You found an extension cord?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Just don't tell anyone I pilfered it from my boombox." "Boombox?" she snickered. "What the hell did you have a boombox down here for?" "Hey, not all of us went out and replaced our tape collections with CDs and MP3s. Jay flipped a plate on the floor and connected an end of the extension cord. She saw his hand out of the corner of her eye. He disconnected the lamp from the table near the fluoroscope machine and plugged it into the extension cord. He flicked the switch and a cone of light appeared. "We're in business." She took a deep breath. "Okay, you've got light in your hands. Your knees okay?" "Cracking and clacking, but yeah, I can do this." "All right." She put her fingers on the gooseneck of her lamp. "I can drag this one out a little bit. Give you some cover." "Okay." Jay sounded less than ready, but he squatted down again with an oof. He pointed the lamp's light a half-meter in front of him. "I'm ready." Kate wasn't, not really, but they had to get the M2 into the drain. She wouldn't feel safe until it was in the waste tank and incapable of hurting them or anyone else. "Here we go," she said. She knew her hands were shaking. She just hoped she could give Jay cover in case it moved toward them. "Go." Jay exhaled a nervous breath, and Duck walked forward. The strong light bobbed up and down slightly with each step. Jay grunted into the mic. The M2 was still, its surface seemingly as solid as metal. The bright halogen light edged forward bit by bit. When he was half a meter away, Jay slowly raised the light from the floor and toward the pool. As the rectangle of light obliterated the remaining shadows, Kate took in a deep breath. It was now or never. Jay paused, the light mere centimeters away from the M2. He exhaled loudly and then shined the light directly at the black. The surface bubbled immediately. The pool moved backward out of the light, leaving smoke in its wake. "Jesus," Kate said. "Okay, drive it toward the drain." Jay said nothing. She heard his breathing turn to panting. She couldn't imagine how hot it was inside that suit. He dropped down to his knees and shuffled forward. The pool smoked and vibrated as the light touched its edge. It moved backward again. The tendrils that strayed from the center had disappeared back into the pool. When it moved like a single organism. The drain was still several meters away. Kate crept forward. She had enough slack in the lamp's cord to cover Jay for another half-meter. After that, he was on his own. She squatted down and pointed her lamp at the pool as well. Tendrils of smoke rose from the viscous fluid and it slid backward to get out of the light. Each movement revealed more impossibly clean tile. Jay crept forward another step. The black moved backward. The middle of the pool started to quiver. "Jay?" Kate licked her lips. "What is it doing?" "I don't know," he said. He lifted the lamp's neck a few centimeters and focused the light on the middle of the pool. A white spot appeared on the quivering mass. The liquid bubbled, and then a hole of clean tile appeared. The mass of black had hollowed itself out like a donut, the rest of its mass distributed around it. Jay moved the light to one of the edges. The black responded by filling the hole it had left and pulling back once more. The quivering radiated outwards. "What is it doing?" Kate said into the mic. "It's almost like something rose from the middle of the pool. Even with the lab lights turned up to full, the shape was difficult to make out. After another second, she knew what it was. "Jay, get back!" A thin tentacle that ended in a hook shot out of the middle of the pool. The edges receded as it focused its mass into the appendage. It wavered in the air and then started slashing. Jay fell backwards on his ass. The lamp slipped from his hands and smashed into the tile floor. The bulb shattered. The bright spot on the pool of black disappeared. "Jay!" Kate yelled. The appendage grew in length. The top of the hook swiped at the table. Jay tried to shuffle backward, but the suit was too bulky. Kate gritted her teeth and moved as far as the cord would let her. She pointed the light right in front of Jay. The tentacle lashed out and into the rays of light. Smoke billowed out from the hook's end. The appendage flew back into the pool with a slurp. The black moved backward, away from the light. A new appendage grew out and grabbed the table leg. It pulled. The table rattled and then started to tip. The fluoroscopy machine wobbled, and then the table came crashing down. Kate shivered with fear. A sizzling sound started behind the trashed piece of furniture. Kate's hands shook, but she kept the light facing a half-meter in front of them. "Fuck me," Jay panted into the mic. "We have to get out of here." "You got that right. And what the hell is that sound?" The sizzling hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown louder. A puff of smoke, or maybe steam, rose into the air from behind the overturned table. "Get up!" Kate grabbed Jay's hand and lifted. He was heavy, and for a moment she wasn't certain she could help him to his feet. He finally grasped her other hand and pulled himself up. Both of their faceplates were fogged from the exertion. They stumbled backwards. Kate jerked as the cord from her lamp ran out of slack. "Shit! Leave it!" Jay yelled. She put it down on the floor, the bright light casting a halo a meter in front of them. They continued moving backwards toward the glass partition separating them from the hallway. The sizzling sound slowed and then disappeared. "We have to get out of here," Jay said. "Like, now." "Mike said we have to—" "Fuck Mike! Fuck the CDC!" Jay's panting chuffed into the mic. "Oh shit, what the hell is that?" Kate followed his gaze. Something peered at them over the top of the table. A black stalk with a scorpion's dead eye stared at them. "Did it grow?" The table wobbled. Something appeared at the side of it. An impossibly black, three-toed claw scratched at the floor. "Oh, my God," Jay's voice shivered. Another puff of smoke rose from behind the table. The eye stalk waved in the air. The sizzling sound ramped up. "Fuck the CDC," Kate said. She bolted for the door. Jay followed. Something squealed along the floor. She was afraid to turn and look. Her gloved fingers fumbled with the door handle. "Hurry!" Jay shouted. Kate finally got her grip on the handle and pulled. The door opened and a rush of air whooshed into the room. She scrambled out of the lab and held the door for Jay. Her headset filled with gibbering as Jay shut the door behind them. When she looked through the glass, her heart stopped. The table the M2 had hid behind had been thrown into the wall. Several other tables lay on their sides as well. Broken lab equipment was scattered across the floor. In the middle of the room, a squat black thing stood on several legs of differing sizes. Some had 3 toes, others 5. 2 eye stalks waved in the air, dead eyes staring at her. The thing scrambled over the broken and smashed equipment. Smoke rose from the floor where it touched plastic and circuit boards. They melted into its grotesque body, and it grew larger before her eyes. "Hey!" Kate jumped. So did Jay. She turned and saw Neil and Bill. They had come out of their lab as well. The 2 men were still in their clean room suits, sans hoods. "What the hell is that?" Bill yelled. She didn't want to see what it was doing now. "Did you see it?" Neil nodded. "We saw it through the glass in our lab, right after we talked to Mike." "Is that the M2? Jay pulled off his hood and tossed it away. He ripped out the headset and dropped it to the floor. "Yes, goddammit, that thing is the oil." Kate pulled off her hood and held it by one hand as she struggled for breath. Her hair was a matted, drenched mess. "We have to kill it. It's eating anything that's not metal or glass." "Jesus," Bill said. His cheeks were pale beneath his 5 o'clock shadow. He looked as though he'd been awake for years. It made her wonder how she looked. "It's afraid of the light," she said. "Bullshit." Bill shook his head. It's not having any problems tearing the hell out of the lab. No, she said. Only broad spectrum, sunlight or halogens. All four of them started as someone banged on the door at the end of the hallway. Kate turned toward it. I hope that's the CDC, she said. The door banged again. There was a murmur of voices, and then the banging stopped. The beep of the card scanner echoed in the hall. The door squealed open. Jacob stepped aside as three people clad in green moon suits walked into the hall. CDC, stay where you are, one of them yelled. A crash from inside the lab made the four scientists turn. Kate caught a glimpse of something moving on the ceiling, and then it was gone. Where did it go? Jay asked. Kate shivered. Into the air ducts,